Naomi West hadn't planned on moving. The idea of starting over at her age after building a stable business and carving out a life in the city's creative core wasn't exactly appealing. But when her long-term relationship quietly imploded and the lease on her downtown apartment shot up by nearly 30% in a single year, she did what she always did, adapted. She found herself scouring listings, looking not just for square footage or proximity to her art gallery, but for silence, for autonomy, for a place that didn't constantly pull energy out of her. And then she saw it. A sharp-cornered two-story house in a private, gated neighborhood near the edge of town. Too new to be sterile, too old to be flashy, it offered something rare: discretion. The neighborhood was known for its privacy, for its uniform lawns and neutral fences, for never appearing in the local papers. The kind of place where people locked their front gates out of habit, not fear. And that suited her just fine. The purchase was smooth. Almost too smooth in retrospect. The paperwork was handled in neat stacks with a smile from the closing agent and a binder full of guidelines handed to her with rehearsed precision. The architectural control rules, landscaping restrictions, approved mailbox styles, all part of what the board referred to as neighborhood continuity. Naomi didn't argue. She had no plans to test boundaries or ruffle feathers. She just wanted her own corner of quiet, a home she could come back to without feeling like she had to perform. The house itself was perfect. Hardwood floors with character, a back patio that caught just enough sun in the morning, and a small studio upstairs with high ceilings where she could sketch or decompress after curating other people's art all day. For the first 2 months, everything ran like clockwork. She kept to herself, greeted her immediate neighbors when they made eye contact, and spent most of her evenings reorganizing furniture, drinking wine on the patio, or simply listening to the soft murmur of sprinklers in the distance. She even attended the monthly board meeting once, not because she cared, but because she thought it might help to know the tone of the room. The meeting was exactly as she expected. Half policy, half passive aggression. The president of the association, Joel Crane, ran the show like a corporate boardroom. Mid-50s, clean-cut, perpetually in a pressed shirt and polished shoes, Joel exuded the kind of low-grade authoritarian charm that certain people mistake for competence. He thanked everyone for their commitment to the community, in a tone that suggested none of them had a choice. Naomi listened, said nothing, and left early, not because she was offended, but because she'd seen enough to know that these people didn't want engagement. They wanted submission. And still, nothing prepared her for the morning her car disappeared. It was a Tuesday, warm and dry. Naomi had a delivery scheduled for her gallery, a new piece from a sculptor out of Seattle, and she was on her way out the door when she realized her driveway was empty. No tire marks, no broken glass, just the faint outline of where her car had sat every night for weeks. At first she thought it had been stolen, but there was no sign of forced entry. The gate was untouched. The lock on the side yard was in place. Confused, she walked the perimeter, trying to suppress the rising knot in her stomach. She double-checked the security app on her phone. No alerts, no motion. Then she saw it. Tucked between 2 HOA newsletters in her mailbox was an envelope, unmarked, sealed with a small adhesive sticker, embossed with the neighborhood emblem. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, thick and smooth to the touch. The message was typed, centered, and disturbingly brief. Some lessons need to be taught the hard way. Consider this one of them. That was it. No name, no signature, no explanation. Just that smug, bureaucratic vagueness designed to make the recipient feel small, feel like questioning it would only make things worse. Naomi stood on the porch with the note in one hand, her other hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something older, deeper. Anger. Controlled, patient, boiling just beneath the surface. She had known people like this before. People who wore professionalism like armor, who used policy as a weapon, who smiled as they punished you for daring to maintain a sense of self. She called the neighborhood gatehouse. The security staff confirmed, yes, the vehicle was removed. No, they wouldn't say who authorized it. "You'll need to speak with the board," the man on the line said, his voice too calm to be innocent. "We're just instructed to open the gate when the service trucks arrive." She asked for records, plate numbers, timestamps, anything. He paused for a moment before replying, "You'll need to file a formal request with administration. I'm not permitted to release that information." Click. Within an hour, Naomi had called the towing companies in the area. None had any record of a vehicle removed from her street. When she finally got through to the municipal tow lot, the dispatcher said the car wasn't there either. The woman even double-checked for her, asked for the VN, and looked up private contracts. "I'm sorry," she said after several minutes. "There's nothing here. Are you sure it wasn't repossessed?" Naomi almost laughed at the absurdity. The car was fully paid off, registered in her name, insurance current, everything legal. But the dispatcher's question didn't irritate her. It clarified something else, that whoever took her car didn't do it through official channels. Which meant this wasn't a policy violation. This was personal. That evening, as the sun sank behind the fences and the sidewalks fell quiet, Naomi sat at her dining table, the note laid flat in front of her. She wasn't impulsive, not anymore. But she knew this wasn't something that would fade on its own. She didn't care about the car, not really. It was a machine. Replaceable. What mattered was the message, the implication, the assumption that she would tolerate being treated like a child out of line. Whoever made that decision hadn't done it on their own. There were procedures, chains of approval, records. And somewhere in that paper trail, someone had signed off on punishing her. Not for a crime, but for a perceived offense. A message from the invisible ruling class that ran her new home like a fortress. Naomi poured herself a glass of water. She didn't reach for wine. Not tonight. This required clarity. Precision. She opened her laptop not to Google how to sue your neighborhood, but to start collecting names, contact dates, documents. No grand plans, no vigilante theatrics. She didn't need to expose anyone. She just needed to prove to herself and to them that she wasn't the kind of person you could teach a lesson to without consequences, and she wasn't alone. She just didn't know it yet. The following day, Naomi did not go to her gallery. She canceled 2 meetings and turned off her phone for everything except emergencies. She had no desire to start her morning hanging new canvases or explaining to clients why her voice sounded tired. Instead, she sat at her kitchen counter with a notebook, the association handbook spread out beside her, and began what she called the slow work, combing through policy, regulation, and board correspondence. She had no intention of screaming into the void or filing angry complaints that would vanish into some digital folder. If they were going to treat her like an enemy of order, then she'd make them realize just how methodical a response could look. She started with what she could verify. The towing of her car had not been municipal. That meant it was either private or undeclared. No registered towing company had a record. Her insurance company hadn't been contacted. There was no violation posted to her resident profile in the community portal. The note she had received was not on official HOA letterhead, just the neighborhood crest, embossed on cheap paper. All this pointed to one conclusion. Whoever had authorized the removal of her car had done so off the record, but with insider access. That narrowed the possibilities considerably. She went to the association office the next day. It was a converted home in the center of the neighborhood, designed to look welcoming, with a faux porch and pale shutters. Inside, it had all the warmth of a DMV. The receptionist didn't bother hiding her boredom as Naomi signed in. "Mr. Crane isn't seeing residents without an appointment," the woman said, without looking up. "And he's fully booked this week." Naomi didn't flinch. She knew the name by now. Joel Crane, the president of the board. His name appeared on nearly every community bulletin, every official update, every enforcement notice. "I'm not here to see him," Naomi said, voice flat. "I'm here to file a formal request for vehicle removal documentation." The woman blinked once, clearly thrown off. Naomi slid a folded sheet across the desk, complete with dates, times, and a written statement. "Under the community's transparency clause, I'm entitled to any internal communication or authorizations related to punitive action involving my property." The receptionist hesitated, then took the paper. "We'll review this with legal," she said. "Expect a response in 10 business days." Naomi turned and left without a word. 10 days passed and there was no response. On the 11th day, she received an envelope tucked between catalogs in her mailbox. This time, the letter was on official association letterhead. It read, "Miss West, your request for internal documentation regarding the removal of your vehicle has been denied on the grounds of administrative discretion. No further action will be taken on this matter." There was no signature. Naomi stared at the words for a long moment, then placed the letter next to the first note. Side by side, they represented the same message. You don't control anything here. It would have been easy, perhaps even expected, for her to back down at this point. Most residents would have. She wasn't new to power games, but this wasn't just about a car or a bruised ego. This was about process being weaponized to disguise punishment, about a supposedly transparent system being used to punish with impunity. The implications were clear. Her silence was expected. Compliance was the only acceptable form of communication. But Naomi didn't comply out of fear or submission. If she followed rules, it was because the rules were sound. These were not. She decided it was time to shift her approach. If the system wouldn't acknowledge her within, she would work from the outside. Naomi contacted her attorney, not for a lawsuit, but to request an intermediary. She wanted a third-party mediator to request documentation formally. This wasn't about threats. It was about escalation by procedure. She explained everything. Every letter, every unanswered call, every non-response. The attorney, a composed woman in her 40s named Sloane Decker, listened without interruption. Then she asked only one question. Do you want to pursue legal action, or do you want to win? Naomi didn't hesitate. I want them to regret underestimating me. Decker filed a legal demand for all communications relating to Naomi's property, citing misuse of association authority, unexplained punitive action, and unauthorized access to resident assets. The letter was direct, formal, and without posturing. 2 days later, Naomi received another letter, not from the association, but from a private firm representing them. It was a cease and desist. The letter accused her of harassment, of disruptive behavior, and of spreading false accusations against members of the board. It was a textbook deflection, one meant to scare, to corner, to imply she had crossed a line. But it also confirmed one crucial thing. They were reacting now, which meant they were nervous. Naomi didn't respond, not directly. Instead, she took the letter to Decker, who drafted a reply stating that retaliatory legal action would be noted and presented as evidence of institutional bullying should litigation occur. The message was clear. If you push, we'll push harder, but within the law. Naomi wasn't looking for a settlement. She wanted discovery, she wanted access, and she wanted names. That night, she found a box on her doorstep. It wasn't wrapped. No label, no note. Just a medium-sized cardboard box sealed with one strip of packing tape. She brought it inside carefully, checking its weight. Light. She opened it slowly. Inside was her garage clicker, missing since the day her car vanished, and a folded parking citation, the ink almost smeared from water damage. On it, someone had scrawled in thick marker, "You're not special." Naomi sat down. For the first time since this began, she felt her hands tremble. Not from fear, from calculation. Whoever had done this was watching her movements, knew her routines, and wanted her to know it. This wasn't about regulations anymore. This was psychological. She changed her locks that night, called the locksmith, waited until after 10 p.m., paid the emergency fee, replaced every access point, including the garage receiver. She notified Decker the next morning, filed a police report, not for the box, but for unauthorized property access. The officer took her statement with detached professionalism, logged it as a non-emergency, and gave her a case number she already knew would go nowhere. And still, she did not panic. Instead, she started tracking. She created a daily log of everything she saw. Unusual vehicles, repeated license plates, which streetlights flickered at odd hours, which neighbors suddenly stopped making eye contact. She didn't write it down for paranoia. She wrote it to establish patterns. That was the key. Power didn't thrive in chaos. It thrived in predictability. And Naomi was determined to stop being predictable. Then, 3 days after the cease and desist, she got the first real break. Her attorney informed her that the city's transportation department had responded to a secondary request, a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, petition for permit records and contractor activity logs in her neighborhood. It turned out that 4 separate transport services had filed temporary permits for vehicle removal from her area over the past year, none of which were listed on official community board records. One of them, in fact, had made a request just a day before her car vanished. And the name attached to that request? A mid-level property manager contracted by the board, someone whose name Naomi had never seen, but whose billing records tied directly to Joel Crane's discretionary expense budget. She wasn't sure what bothered her more, the fact that the name existed or that it had never appeared in any of the public documentation the association was supposed to provide. She asked Decker for more. Company affiliations, bank connections, anything that would establish a pattern. Now we're not just dealing with overreach, her lawyer said grimly. We may be looking at fraud. Naomi didn't smile. She didn't speak, but inside something hardened. She wasn't just protecting herself anymore, she was exposing something rotten that had long since started to fester, and whoever decided to use her as an example to make her a lesson had chosen the wrong person to educate. By the start of the following week, Naomi had already shifted into a new rhythm. One not built around ordinary routines, but around containment, control, and watching every step she made within the tight boundaries of the place she now called home. What had once been a sanctuary, a private residence nestled among manicured hedges and ornamental fountains, had become a chessboard. Every car that drove past her window, every unfamiliar pedestrian, every official notice now came with the same question. Was it a move or a message? And while her attorney Sloan Decker handled the legal corridors, Naomi began tracing the pattern on the surface. What she quickly realized was that the problem wasn't just Joel Crane or a single act of petty retaliation. It was a structure designed to reward silence and punish resistance. And she had just become an internal disruption that the system wasn't used to absorbing. The first obvious retaliation came quietly, without preamble or official acknowledgement. One afternoon, Naomi returned from a brief supply run to find that her irrigation system had been shut off. The small, delicate flower beds she'd planted with care had already begun to show signs of heat stress in the unrelenting sun. Her internal timer, a smart system connected to her phone, showed no errors, but the water pressure was gone. She contacted the utilities department, and after 3 different transfers, someone finally told her that access had been interrupted due to scheduled maintenance requested by the homeowners committee. Naomi had made no such request, and yet, when she asked for documentation, she was told that, for community privacy, individual service logs are not shared externally. It was the subtlety of it that unnerved her more than the act itself. These weren't criminal acts in the traditional sense. No broken windows, no threats screamed through voicemail. These were calculated disruptions, designed not to destroy but to frustrate, to exhaust. She checked her exterior cameras only to find that 2 of them had lost signal earlier that week. One had been physically moved. The footage was scrambled, corrupted in the exact window of time when the irrigation box had likely been accessed. The evidence wasn't enough to take to the police, but it was enough to know that someone had been on her property. She took it to Decker, who nodded grimly and said, "This is what escalation looks like when it's performed by people with too much authority and too many backdoors." They agreed to strengthen the chain of documentation. Naomi began photographing everything, timestamping each image, backing up her records to a secured cloud drive only her attorney had access to. Meanwhile, Decker pushed further with her investigations, widening the financial search and submitting a formal complaint to the City Ethics Board regarding misuse of funds and procedural violations related to private contracting. That, she told Naomi, wouldn't lead to instant results, but it would start a clock. "These people like to operate in silence," she explained, "but now they know someone's watching the clock run." Then came the noise. At 2:37 a.m., on a Thursday morning, Naomi was jolted awake by what she thought was thunder. But when she reached her bedroom window, she saw it wasn't weather. It was noise by design. Parked just across the street, well within the limits of legal ambiguity, was a flatbed truck loaded with building equipment. A generator ran loudly beside it, powering industrial lights pointed at the house next door. Two men in reflective vests stood idly nearby, pretending to check equipment. The work order taped to the windshield claimed emergency utility remediation. But it didn't take an engineer to know that nothing was being repaired at that hour. When Naomi stepped outside and called across the street to ask what was happening, one of the men looked her in the eye and said only, "Routine check." No apology. No attempt to justify the noise. She called the non-emergency police line. By the time an officer arrived 40 minutes later, the truck was gone. All that remained were tire tracks and a faint smell of diesel. The officer shrugged and told her that construction miscommunications happen, but added, "You're not the first resident who's called in late-night disturbances from that zone." That phrase, "from that zone," lingered in her mind. What zone? Her property? The block? She tried to ask, but the officer had already turned back to his cruiser. That day, Naomi finally allowed herself to talk to someone in the neighborhood. Not a friend, not a confidant, but a potential witness. The woman lived 4 houses down. Older, quiet, often tending to her roses with gloves and a wide-brimmed hat. Naomi approached her fence casually, complimented her garden, and gently asked whether she'd heard the noise last night. The woman glanced around before replying, "Best not to dwell on things here, dear." Her tone was kind, but there was fear behind it. And that fear told Naomi more than any answer could. She went home and called Decker again. "They're isolating me," she said. "Not just logistically, socially. They want the rest of the residents to associate me with disruption." Decker didn't argue. "That's a tactic," she agreed. "But it's also a sign they're worried. When power gets sloppy, it gets loud." She encouraged Naomi to focus not just on defense, but on pressure points, figuring out where Joel Crane was weakest. The next move came not through disruption, but through silence. Naomi received no monthly bulletin, no updates, no voting ballots. Her name, it seemed, had been scrubbed from the digital communication list. She could still log into the resident portal, but no new files were posted for her account. No event notices. No board meeting summaries. It was as if digitally she had ceased to exist. But digital records, Naomi had learned, weren't the only ones that mattered. Sloan Decker's firm had been quietly building a case, mapping every financial connection between Crane and the various private contractors hired by the board. What they uncovered in late June was the start of something real. Multiple maintenance contracts totaling over $600,000 awarded to a company called North Hollow Infrastructure Services, a firm registered only 6 months earlier in another county. On paper, it appeared legitimate. But the owner's listed address, phone number, and even tax filings were linked to a property recently purchased by a family member of Crane's. The shell structure was clear, and it wasn't just a single company. There were at least 3, all siphoning small, regular payments that added up over years. Naomi didn't get excited. She didn't celebrate. Instead, she made copies of everything. And then she sent a letter, not to the board, but to a group of residents she knew by name. People listed in public filings as property owners, investors, or subcommittee volunteers. She didn't accuse anyone. She didn't make threats. She simply sent a message. "I am currently involved in a legal review regarding financial irregularities in neighborhood resource allocation. If you've noticed anything unusual or would like to review what I found, please contact my attorney." And she included Decker's number. The message was precise, respectful, non-accusatory, but it detonated something. Within 3 days, Decker received 6 phone calls. 2 of them came from individuals who had once served on small advisory roles and had resigned without explanation. One confirmed that invoices had been paid to ghost vendors but was afraid to testify. Another admitted that meeting minutes were often revised before being distributed. Most importantly, one of the calls came from a city records officer. The woman on the line confirmed that Crane had submitted proposals for infrastructure projects that didn't match what had actually been executed. And that meant one thing above all else. Crane had falsified public documents, and if proven, that was not just grounds for board censure, it was criminal. Naomi did not feel victorious. She felt still, like standing in the eye of something vast and dangerous. She knew better than to underestimate someone like Crane. He wasn't going to panic, not yet. Men like him didn't run when threatened. They tightened the screws. And now she was on a list. Not of disruptive residents, but of threats that needed removal. Permanent removal, if possible. That night, someone tried her back door. It didn't open. It was locked, bolted, reinforced. But she heard the handle twist 3 times, slow and deliberate. She stood in the hallway, holding her breath, hand on her phone, waiting. The cameras outside caught nothing. No motion, no face, just the subtle swaying of the trees. She didn't call the police. She didn't want to give Crane the satisfaction of seeing her panic. Instead, she did what she knew best. She sat down, and she documented everything. By mid-July, the air in the neighborhood had shifted. Not just the weather, though the heat had grown heavier, and the evenings more oppressive, but the atmosphere itself. Naomi could feel it in the glances she caught at the community mailbox, in the way conversations ceased when she approached, in the subtle stiffness of neighbors who once offered polite nods but now hurried their pace when she stepped onto the sidewalk. Something had changed, not in her, but around her. The silence had a shape to it now, as if the community had collectively agreed to disown her, not because of guilt or offense, but because acknowledging her would mean acknowledging the fault lines beneath the clean lines of hedges and driveways. She had, intentionally or not, ripped back the curtain. And what lay beneath wasn't just one man's abuse of power. It was a network built on routine complicity. Everyone had something to lose by letting her speak too loudly. Naomi didn't need their approval. She needed traction, and that came in the form of one unlikely lead. Sloan Decker had finally received a packet of internal expense reports through a city-mandated release, and buried among the invoices was something that didn't quite fit the pattern. A reimbursement for private transportation, specifically a single-day rental of a luxury sedan booked under the name of an association committee assistant. The date matched precisely the morning Naomi's car had disappeared. But this wasn't just a rental. The transaction included a line item for perimeter assistance, a term Naomi had never seen in any prior documentation. She asked Decker what it meant. Her attorney's response was sharp and immediate. It's language used when they need to move something discreetly under a private security contract. It's a euphemism, and it means someone didn't want a paper trail that pointed to law enforcement or standard municipal procedures. Naomi felt her stomach tighten, not out of fear, but confirmation. They hadn't just removed her car to provoke her. They had used private resources to do it, possibly paid for by pooled community funds disguised as a generic operation. Still, that alone wasn't enough. In the legal world, suspicion meant little without context, and Naomi needed more than breadcrumbs. She needed a direct thread between Crane and the firms used to funnel these expenses. That's when Decker decided to take a more aggressive approach. She reached out to a compliance officer at a state-level oversight board, someone she'd worked with on a prior case involving corrupt property associations. The woman, Evelyn Maddox, agreed to review the materials discreetly. Within 48 hours, Evelyn responded, not with reassurance, but concern. Her team had cross-referenced North Hollow infrastructure services with other vendor networks used across 3 counties. What they found was a pattern. Inflated project costs, matching descriptions across different addresses, identical invoice language, and nearly identical payment structures, all tied back to boards chaired by individuals with personal or financial ties to Joel Crane. It was the first time Naomi saw the scale. Up until that moment, she had assumed she was dealing with a small empire of arrogance, a man who had learned to manipulate a limited system. But now it was clear. Crane wasn't just skimming. He was part of something bigger, more structured, and likely more protected than she had anticipated. Naomi didn't say anything for a long time after reading the summary. She simply stared at the screen, letting the implications settle. If this was true, if Crane was connected to a network of shell vendors used to extract funds from multiple communities, then what happened to her car wasn't a personal vendetta. It was a warning shot from someone whose confidence in his untouchability was no longer theoretical. Naomi met with Decker that evening at the lawyer's office. Not a phone call, not a Zoom session. She wanted to sit face-to-face to make sure they were on the same page. Decker had already begun preparing an extended legal motion to request a court-monitored financial audit. If we push for this too early, she warned, we lose the element of surprise. If we wait too long, they'll bury or scrub everything. Naomi nodded. Then we move in rhythm, not too fast, but not quiet either. That same night, she posted a single public message to her resident portal profile. Just one sentence. Financial transparency protects all of us, especially when silence no longer does. No accusations, no names, just friction. The response was immediate. 3 residents reached out through private messages, one of whom Naomi didn't know by name. Another woman, identified only by her initials on the message thread, asked to meet in person. Naomi agreed. They met in a local cafe outside the neighborhood limits. The woman, tense and clearly anxious, explained that she had served on an unofficial landscaping advisory group and had signed off on project budgets that, in retrospect, didn't make sense. At the time, she had been told the figures were estimates, adjusted for seasonal maintenance. When she tried to ask for breakdowns, she was told she was too new to need that level of access. Now, seeing Naomi's post, she realized that those figures were not just exaggerated, they were fraudulent. She handed Naomi a copy of a spreadsheet she'd kept, something she had printed months ago before resigning from her volunteer position. The totals listed didn't match anything Naomi had seen in the public records. Some projects listed as completed never even happened. But the names attached were familiar, and among them, at the bottom of a long column of signatures, was Joel Crane's, a real signature, a direct link between his approval and a non-existent contract. Naomi brought it to Decker the next morning. Her lawyer took one look and said, "This changes everything. This takes us beyond internal misconduct. We're looking at the basis for a forensic audit, state level, potential felony level misappropriation." But it also meant one other thing. "If we proceed, Naomi," she said, her voice lower now, "you need to understand. Retaliation won't be passive anymore. He's going to try to shut this down, personally, legally, any way he can." Naomi didn't flinch. She simply said, "Then we need to make sure it's too late for him to bury it." That was the day Decker filed the first formal notification with the Attorney General's Office for fraud review under consumer protection statutes. It wasn't a lawsuit. Not yet. It was a signal. A flare shot into the sky above everything Crane had tried to hide. Naomi went home that night knowing that the moment had passed for playing within invisible lines. She had crossed into another realm now, one where decisions had weight, where people lost careers, where the walls didn't protect anyone once the foundation cracked. She didn't sleep well that night, not because she was afraid, but because she had seen the bigger picture and she finally understood something she hadn't wanted to accept before. The system didn't turn a blind eye by accident. It had been built to keep eyes closed. By the time the formal notification reached the Attorney General's office, Naomi had already begun preparing for backlash. Not the kind that came through legal filings or official notices, but the kind that arrived in the form of deliberate, silent sabotage, the kind that couldn't be easily traced but could still unravel a life if left unchecked. She knew Crane wouldn't strike through obvious channels anymore to fake it in. The man had already exhausted his routine forms of control, and now stood exposed to scrutiny that extended beyond the safety net of local compliance. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was just how quickly his response would evolve from institutional evasion into direct coordinated retaliation that blurred the lines between policy enforcement and personal warfare. It began, predictably, with her property. One morning, Naomi opened her front door to find an official-looking notice, zip-tied to the wrought iron gate. The paper was laminated, stamped with the association's insignia, and read, "Notice of violation. Unauthorized modifications to exterior fixtures." The violation referred to her motion-sensitive lighting system, installed legally, reviewed once, all ready and cleared by the association 6 months earlier. This time, however, the claim stated that her lights exceeded the approved lumen output and disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood during nocturnal hours. There was no warning, no hearing, just a fine, $750, payable within 10 days, with an added clause noting that failure to comply would result in a lien placed against the property. Naomi didn't bother calling. She sent the document straight to Sloan Decker, who filed an injunction within 24 hours. But the next day, there was another violation, this time citing excessive foliage infringing upon common path access, which Naomi knew was nonsense. She maintained her hedges meticulously, and the only path within 10 feet of her property line was a private access route that only association board members used. The violations piled up, each one more absurd than the last. Non-compliant mailbox hardware, unsanctioned decorative features, and unapproved planter that had been sitting on her porch since the day she moved in. Decker called it administrative strangulation, a tactic used by power structures that lacked a clear escape route and instead tried to bury opponents in procedural debris, hoping that legal fatigue or emotional burnout would force them to relent. But Naomi didn't burn out. She got sharper. While the association escalated on paper, Crane began tightening the social perimeter. Neighbors Naomi had never spoken to began leaving anonymous notes on her gate. Some passive-aggressive, others openly hostile. One simply read, "You ruined this place for all of us." Another, written in a more careful hand, warned her to let it go before it gets worse. Naomi kept them all. She photographed each one, time-stamped the images, and forwarded them to Decker, who by now had begun assembling a packet for law enforcement, just in case the campaign shifted from psychological harassment to physical. Then came the tampering. Late one evening, Naomi heard a familiar metallic screech from her side yard. When she went out to investigate, she found the lock to her exterior gate partially sawed through. Not broken entirely, but clearly compromised. Whoever had done it didn't intend to get in that night. They wanted her to know that they could. She called the police, who arrived 40 minutes later, glanced at the damage, and wrote it up as vandalism without entry. No fingerprints were lifted. No canvassing was done. Just a shrug and a suggestion to install a motion camera, as if the system she already had in place hadn't been enough. Naomi didn't argue. She just noted the time, took her own photos, and replaced the lock herself with a commercial-grade deadbolt, anchoring it into the concrete frame with reinforced steel brackets. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. And patterns once seen couldn't be ignored. What Crane likely hadn't counted on was that Naomi wasn't working alone anymore. Through Decker's quiet outreach, 3 former board members had agreed to submit confidential statements, one of whom admitted to signing off on blank invoices at Crane's request to expedite maintenance reimbursements. Another revealed that Crane had, on multiple occasions, overridden voting procedures by falsely reporting unanimous board decisions when at least 2 members had abstained. These weren't hearsay claims. They were typed, notarized, and delivered under seal. And they didn't just confirm misconduct. They laid the groundwork for criminal fraud, but information alone wasn't enough. Naomi and Decker needed timing, and timing in cases like these was everything. They had to wait for the financial records subpoena to be approved, and they knew Crane would try to preemptively erase or alter as much as he could before the documents were pulled. That's when Naomi made a calculated move. Not through courts, not through letters, but through leverage. She reached out to one of the vendors listed in the questionable invoices, a small landscape firm listed under a generic LLC. Her inquiry was simple, a public request for a service quote, nothing more. But when the representative replied, his signature block included an email domain tied to a private real estate consultancy, one that had coincidentally listed a vacation property in Crane's name the year prior. Naomi didn't say anything. She forwarded the exchange to Decker, who cross-referenced the address and discovered that the property had been purchased in cash through a trust managed by the same consultancy. This was the moment Naomi understood that the fraud extended beyond her neighborhood. Crane wasn't just redirecting funds, he was laundering them into long-term, low-visibility investments, designed to mask personal gain as professional expense. And while she wasn't a federal investigator, she didn't need to be. She had already sent the early documentation to the state ethics board, and now they had probable cause to expand the inquiry. Within 72 hours, the board issued a formal notice of intent to audit. Not just Crane's role as president, but the entirety of the association's discretionary spending over a 5-year period. The letter was public, entered into record, and shared across municipal agencies. That's when the mask came off. Naomi received a letter via certified mail, signed not by the association but by Crane himself. It accused her of defamation, unlawful disruption of community functions, and malicious interference with contractual relationships. It gave her 7 days to retract her statements, cease communication with vendors, and agree to a gag order, or face a civil suit seeking damages in excess of $500,000. The letter was written like a weapon, measured, precise, and entirely devoid of the bluster that characterized his earlier behavior. This wasn't retaliation. This was panic wearing a tie. Decker prepared the formal response, citing every violation of protocol, every false claim, and attaching over 50 pages of documentation ready to be submitted in court if necessary. But Naomi didn't stop there. She made copies, printed, bound, and sealed, and distributed them to every resident listed in the association's public registry. No accusations, no editorial, just documentation, labeled for your awareness. Current state audit and legal activity concerning association financial conduct. By the end of the week, Crane's tone changed. Residents began requesting special meetings. 2 board members resigned. A petition circulated demanding temporary suspension of Crane's authority pending review. He didn't respond publicly, but Naomi noticed that the violations stopped. No more notices. No more fake fines. No more trucks idling near her home at night. Just silence. But she didn't trust it. Not yet. Because silence in a system like this was never peace. It was retreat. Recalibration. And Naomi knew enough about predators to recognize when one had slipped back into the dark. Not because it was finished, but because it had started to bleed. The day the audit team arrived, no one in the neighborhood waved. Naomi watched from behind her tinted living room window as 3 government vehicles with unmarked plates parked at the end of the cul-de-sac, just outside the association office, which had been locked for the past week under the pretense of operational restructuring. 2 men and 1 woman stepped out, dressed in plain clothes but carrying black leather satchels, their posture neither hurried nor hesitant. They didn't knock. They entered with keys already in hand, which meant the entry wasn't requested. It was compelled. Naomi didn't need to be in the room to know that what followed inside was meticulous, clinical, and entirely without discussion. They weren't there to negotiate. They were there to extract. Crane, notably, was nowhere to be seen that morning. He hadn't been seen in person since the community mailing that included Naomi's sealed packet of documentation. Rumors had circulated, of course, that he was sick, that he was away for family reasons, that he was seeking legal counsel for unrelated matters. But those were nothing more than air. Naomi had long since stopped wondering what he would do next. Crane had already played every card his position had allowed, and now he was running on borrowed time. But what surprised her wasn't the audit. It was how quickly everything began to unravel once that thin veneer of control cracked. The woman leading the audit, a calm, stone-eyed compliance officer named Raina Holt, was known in regulatory circles for a particular kind of efficiency, the kind that didn't rely on threats or warnings but on records and timelines. She didn't speak to residents, didn't appear in public, but she did issue subpoenas, and within 72 hours of her arrival, the association's financial server had been taken offline and replaced by a portable backup node placed on site by state investigators. Naomi knew this because Decker called her, nearly breathless with what she'd learned. "They've already uncovered 24 duplicated expense entries," she said, "and 6 of them point to direct payments signed by Crane, to vendors who didn't even exist before this year." It was more than mismanagement now, it was fraud in plain view. That week, Naomi received her first official letter from the board in almost a month. Not a violation, not a reprimand, but an announcement. Effective immediately, Joel Crane was stepping down as acting president to allow the board to undergo a full and transparent evaluation of internal procedures. It didn't say whether he'd been removed or if he'd left voluntarily. It didn't mention the audit or the investigation, but it didn't need to. Everyone knew what it meant. The letter was dated 2 days prior, but postmarked the day the audit team arrived. They had tried to get ahead of it, to cast the illusion of control even as it slipped through their fingers. Naomi folded the letter neatly and filed it in the growing binder she kept next to her entryway table. It was a heavy book now, chronological, indexed, full of notes and addenda. She didn't read it anymore, not for herself, but she kept it visible, like a monument or a warning. 2 days later, the first arrest was made. It wasn't Crane. Not yet. But one of his contracted consultants, a man named Baxter Rowe, who had signed off on 3 of the ghost invoices that Decker had traced back to the landscaping contracts. He was detained at his office in a nearby district and charged with falsifying business records and defrauding a homeowners organization. The headline made local news, and while no names from Naomi's neighborhood were mentioned, residents knew what it was about. And more importantly, they knew who had forced it into the light. There was no applause. No neighbor stopped by to thank her. No apology arrived in her mailbox. But the tone of the neighborhood shifted. People walked slower. They looked up. Some even nodded again. It wasn't respect. Not yet. But it was something close to acknowledgement. And in a place built on silence, that was louder than any praise. Decker called Naomi late one evening with a tone Naomi hadn't heard before. Not assertive, not tense, but cautious. "We just got word from Holt's office," she said. "They've filed for seizure of assets related to the misappropriated funds. That includes any property linked to Crane's trust accounts, including the vacation house." Naomi stayed quiet. She knew what that meant. If they can prove the association funds were laundered into that property, Decker continued, he's looking at both state and federal charges. For a moment, Naomi didn't know what to feel. Victory didn't taste the way she thought it would. It wasn't sweet or sharp. It was hollow, necessary, cold. Like finishing the last line of a long letter you never wanted to write, but had no choice but to send. That night, around 11:30, her doorbell rang. She didn't move at first. She watched the monitor. No one stood there. Just an envelope placed carefully at the welcome mat, white and unsealed. She waited 5 full minutes before opening the door. She brought the envelope inside, set it on the counter, and opened it with the same methodical quiet she had practiced since the beginning of all this. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in tight cursive, unsigned. It read, "You think this is over? It never is. We built this place for people who understand. You don't." Naomi didn't panic. She didn't even call Decker. She added the letter to her binder and locked it away. Then she walked into the back room of her house, the one she hadn't used since she moved in, and began unpacking the boxes marked personal. Not to flee, but to stay differently. She knew there were others involved, people who had kept their hands clean while still passing orders behind closed doors. The audit would find them, or it wouldn't. The state would prosecute, or it wouldn't. But Naomi understood now that justice wasn't a destination. It was a pace, a rhythm, a refusal to be silenced, even when silence was easier. The war might not be over, but the balance had shifted, and even if no one else in the neighborhood ever said it aloud, they would remember what happened when someone pushed back. When the rules weren't enough to protect the powerful. When a single resident refused to be taught a lesson and taught one instead. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood settled into an uneasy stillness, like a house after a long storm. Nothing visibly broken, but everything slightly off-kilter, as though the walls remembered the pressure they had once held back. Naomi began to notice small changes, not dramatic, but persistent. The tone of community notices shifted. They arrived more promptly now, worded less like commands and more like requests. The once dismissive receptionist at the association office was replaced by a younger woman who introduced herself with a name, smiled without tightness in her jaw, and ended emails with real punctuation instead of veiled formality. No one acknowledged the audit openly, of course. It remained the elephant in the neighborhood, too large to be ignored but too dangerous to point at. But its presence lingered in every vote, every meeting, every silence. The board, now under interim leadership, hosted its first open yes-nay in years. Naomi did not attend. She didn't need to hear new promises or passive confessions. She had read enough language dressed as reform to know that change, if it came at all, would not come with banners or applause. The investigation continued in the background, like an engine running just out of sight. Crane's name vanished from all official documents, replaced with generic titles like former officer or previous administration, and the legal proceedings against his contractors moved ahead quietly, without spectacle. Naomi watched the updates when they came. Decker still kept her informed, but she no longer reacted to each detail. She had grown past the need to feel vindicated with every turn of the process. There were no arrests in her neighborhood after Roe, no sudden exposure of new figures, but there was a vacuum, a sense of space clearing, and with it came the return of something simpler. Calm. Not peace, never that, but calm enough to breathe. Naomi didn't return to her old life exactly. She kept the gallery but stepped away from day-to-day operations. She hired a new assistant, someone younger, someone who hadn't seen the strain in her face over the past year. Her studio, once unused, became a space she occupied again, not to create for others, but to make sense of what she had just endured. The sketches that emerged were not angry, not literal. They were abstractions of boundaries, studies of compression and escape. She never planned to exhibit them. Some things weren't meant to be shared, they were meant to be survived. Her home changed too. She didn't sell, as some expected. She stayed, but with new conditions. Locks reinforced not because she feared another break-in, but because ownership now meant something different. She added gravel to her side yard to expose foot traffic, installed hidden cameras that fed to a cloud she no longer spoke about, replaced her mailbox with a custom fabricated design that couldn't be pried open without tools. These were not acts of paranoia. They were statements. I'm still here, and I'm watching too. The woman who once moved into the neighborhood seeking privacy now understood that privacy was never guaranteed. It was defended deliberately, daily. Some neighbors came around eventually, but not many. A couple from down the street left a note thanking her for doing the right thing, even when it wasn't popular. Another left a bottle of wine with no message at all. Naomi appreciated the gesture, but didn't invite anyone in. Trust didn't return with kind words or late acknowledgments. It returned, if at all, with time. What surprised her most was the letter from the state office 6 months later, a plain envelope with no seal, just a single-page update. The association had entered into a compliance oversight program for a period of 2 years, subject to quarterly review. It wasn't a criminal verdict. It wasn't the dramatic collapse she might have fantasized about once in the early days of her resistance. But it was real. Documented, recorded, permanent. She placed the letter in the final sleeve of her binder and locked it away, not to forget, but to finish. This wasn't a war she would have chosen. It wasn't even a victory she could celebrate in conventional terms, but it was hers, and no one could take that from her. That evening, she stood on her back porch, the same place she had stood the first week she moved in, before everything changed. The air was cooler now, the sounds of sprinklers and evening wind blending into something that almost resembled quiet. She looked out over her yard. Not the most beautiful in the neighborhood, not the most manicured, but it was hers, and it was intact. And in the center of it, standing exactly where it had always been, was the sculpture she had refused to remove. No one had tried to take it again. And that, she thought, was all the resolution she needed.